Good morning. Hopefully everyone can hear me. A couple of housekeeping items before we get going. This presentation should take 30 minutes, and we'll follow it with 5 minutes of Q&A. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Just click on that and type in the question, and we will answer them at the end. If we run out of time and we're unable to answer your questions, we'll reach back out to you after the presentation directly. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Tim Brady. I am the interim CEO of SBP. I've been in this role for about 2 months. I became involved with SBP over a decade ago as a volunteer, helping build homes with my family. Went to various places where SBP operates in New Orleans and Houston, North and South Carolina, Puerto Rico, places like that. Just had an amazing experience. I joined the board about a year ago. My background is in technology and education. I helped start Yahoo back in the mid-1990s, and then I helped start the QuestBridge program in 2004, which helps today roughly 4,000 bright, low-income students get into the nation's best colleges. So my background is not in disaster recovery. So to get up to speed, I asked the senior leadership team here to educate me, to provide me the context for our work. What happens before, during, and after a natural disaster? How does the money flow? Federal funding, philanthropic dollars, how does that work? And then how does SBP's programs intervene? At what point along that recovery timeline? And they did a fantastic job. It was so good that I asked them to present that to SBP's board at the last board meeting. And then the board was so impressed that they recommended that we offer this out to you all, people that have supported SBP over the years. And we are really grateful for all that support through the years and your continued support. Now, this hurricane season is predicted to be the strongest in 2 decades, which is saying something. So the timing of this presentation seems particularly important. While I'm relatively new to the disaster recovery space, the senior leadership team here at SBP is not. They are veterans. And I'm going to be joined today by 2 of those veterans, Reese May, who is our Chief Strategy Officer, and Thomas Corley, who is our COO. Today's presentation is really intended to share our programs at a high level. Reese will introduce what we call the anatomy of a natural disaster with an overview of the 2 types of federal funding. And then Thomas will follow that by sharing how SBP's program is going to fit into that disaster timeline. And then we'll wrap it up with a real-life example of what happened during Hurricane Ian in 22. If you are joining us today from a company, some of these programs might be able to directly support your team members or customers. And if you're interested in taking a deeper dive into one of these, please reach out. We would love to connect with you about it. Now, in a moment, Reese will share the overview of how federal funding flows after a disaster. Spoiler alert, not very fast. After 18 years of helping families build after a disaster, it's clear that time is the biggest challenge in recovery. A lack of predictability combined with limited resources over many years often pushes people to their breaking point. And it's with these people in mind that SBP has established its mission as shrinking the time between disaster and recovery. Our programs can be summed up into 3 categories: rebuilding homes, increasing resilience, and improving policies. We know that by focusing on these, we can improve outcomes in the following area. Economic mobility. We know that the home is at the intersection between upward mobility and negative generational impacts. 2, climate adaptation. We believe it's too expensive to build back cheaply. Building resiliency into the plan is good both for the individual and for the community. And lastly, economic and racial equity. We all know that disasters disproportionately impact under-resourced communities, older adults, and communities of color. Our goal is to drive more equitable results. With that, I will pass it over to Reese.
Well, thanks, Tim, and thank you, everybody, for joining. What Tim just shared about time really sort of reminds me or takes me back to my early days as an AmeriCorps member at SBP. After serving 2 combat tours in Iraq with the U.S. Marines, I sought to serve my community, and I began that journey a little over 13 years ago in St. Bernard Parish, helping rebuild for families after Katrina. Since then, my experiences in New Orleans and Joplin and New York and New Jersey and Texas and South Carolina and a whole bunch of other places have offered me a really incredible opportunity to see beyond the events that occur in each community after specific disasters, and to see more clearly the challenges that face every community after every disaster. Those common challenges are opportunities for SBP to design and implement more effective solutions. A mission-driven mandate to experiment and create scalable solutions has always been the source of my enthusiasm and the core of my devotion to the work of SBP, where I serve as our Chief Strategy Officer, helping to lead some of SBP's most strategic initiatives. And we'll talk a little bit more about that stuff later. For now, let's take a look, as Tim said, about how SBP describes the anatomy of a natural disaster. So if you move from left to right on this timeline, the basic segments are as follows. You've got your preparedness phase, which runs up until an event occurs. After a disaster event, there'll be a response period, which lasts weeks to months, followed by a recovery and reconstruction period that'll last months to years or longer in the worst circumstances. As you get out into long-term housing recovery, you start to also think about resilience as a kind of return to the preparation phase. And these are the basic phases as we have seen and experienced them in communities around the country. As Tim shared, SBP's mission is to shrink the time between disaster and recovery, time being the natural enemy of recovery in low-income communities. To do that, we first got to understand the general shape of events, especially the flow of federal funding that's directed to help individuals and communities recover after major disasters. The better we understand the nature of the timeline and the key events and the delays that happened in the first place, the better chance we'll have of designing durable and scalable solutions to address that. It's also important to understand the flow of federal funds because in one way or another, government funding plays a major role in helping communities recover within and without SBP's programs. So again, just moving left to right here, the disaster event happens. State and local governments are often overwhelmed, and it's at that point that the governor will request a presidential disaster declaration. Once that declaration has occurred, federal resources are authorized. This comes most notably in the form of FEMA resources that'll be available for qualified applicants, usually within 14 days of a disaster event. Most survivors with low income, FEMA assistance is all of the assistance, disaster-related assistance that they'll ever receive, and more on the importance of that later. The most severely affected states and communities who do get more federal assistance will first have to wait on a literal act of Congress to authorize some supplemental disaster assistance spending, which will immediately be followed by some necessary but lengthy administrative delays within the federal bureaucracy as HUD prepares and allocates funds for affected areas, and they form their plans for use. This is a process that regularly takes 12 to 18 months. Finally, we see wide variation in state and local government grantees' ability to implement the recovery programs once they've received federal funds. Many struggle to get started and fail to achieve the necessary scale. In best case scenarios, NGOs like SBP won't be able to use those long-term federal funds until 2 or 3 years after the disaster occurs, even though we know who needs help in the most severely affected communities today. So importantly, before we move ahead into the next few slides, there are FEMA funds to consider, then long-term disaster recovery funds that flow from Congress through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, then finally charitable funds to consider, and we're going to look at those three in turn over the next 3 slides here. So first are those FEMA funds, which it's important to note that assistance from FEMA is not equal to making a full recovery. FEMA assistance is where the recovery journey begins for the most vulnerable survivors. After severe events, FEMA's individual assistance program provides very limited assistance to cover immediate needs for disaster survivors. Contrary to popular belief and misperception, FEMA does not provide enough assistance for survivors to rebuild or even substantially repair their homes. The maximum grant that you can receive from FEMA is worth around $42,000 in 2024, but getting that amount would mean that your home has to be pretty much totally destroyed. The actual national average FEMA awards around $4,300, so $4,300, just a tenth of the max grant possibility. And you'll note this isn't really enough to cover any significant repairs or replace personal property that's been destroyed. And again, this is all the assistance that most survivors are going to receive. So after FEMA, there's that longer term federal assistance. So community development block grant funds for disaster recovery, they're appropriated by Congress. They flow to the Department of Housing and Urban Development to support long-term rebuilding efforts in the most severely affected communities. But this kind of assistance is uncertain at best. Fewer than half of the 22 communities that received presidential disaster declarations last year went on to receive long-term assistance from HUD. So it's a dubious prospect at best. Most disaster-affected communities don't get these grants, but even the ones that do face really significant delays, as you can see the back and forth pretty here, the delays that attend each step in the process. You see it as money moves from Congress to HUD, back and forth with the states, years pass. There are 3 really significant challenges that we see in the timeline here. First, that wide variation in the 6 to 12 months it takes Congress to authorize some assistance. This really drives home the point that what people get from FEMA matters, because they often don't get this long-term assistance that only comes to a few communities after. Second, you can see there are legal and procedural delays that are built into the back and forth process between the state and the federal government. So anything that can reduce delay or obliterate that period of time really adds a ton of value to the disaster recovery process. And third, there's that wide variation in ramp up time and product quality as individual governments start to implement their recovery programs. If you keep those 3 problems in mind, then I think the logic that underlies a lot of SBP's work and key programs and initiatives will be a little bit clearer. Finally, after long-term assistance, in between the paltry $4,300 that people got from FEMA and that dubious potential of CDBG-DR assistance some years in the future, there are massive unmet community needs. During that 6-month to 2 or longer year gap, the most vulnerable survivors and communities rely on philanthropic resources to provide critically needed services to communities. And I'm going to talk just a little bit more about that on the next slide. So let's take a quick look at the role that philanthropy plays in our very same timeline. So this steep bell curve at the beginning represents how 70% of funds raised for a particular disaster event come within the first 3 weeks after a disaster. During this time, images of destruction are in the news, companies make big commitments, generous individuals from all over the world donate to causes they care about. As you can see, there's a really steep drop off in the weeks after, and that directly correlates to when the coverage stops, when the cameras go away, when another larger or more proximate event hits the news cycle. You'll note we haven't included FEMA funds here because, as we covered on the last slide, FEMA doesn't offer enough to rebuild homes. So the funding that's raised during this period is really what needs to kind of carry recovery efforts from the end of that FEMA assistance to the beginning of any potential long-term assistance that arrives. Notably, more than half of philanthropic donations go to support immediate response activity, not that long-term recovery and rebuilding. And so when you hear SBP advocating for faster long-term recovery, It's that we're really trying to get philanthropic givers to think about the long-term rebuilding that needs to begin, not when the money's available, but right after disaster events. So importantly, while CDBG-DR funds may arrive in a community a couple of years later, the process deploying those funds takes time. You have to solicit and procure vendors. You have to ramp up and achieve the appropriate scale to serve the thousands of survivors who are often waiting on programs like that to materialize. So all that really just goes to show and maybe further demonstrate the importance of philanthropic funding to support the work of SBP to meet critical needs during that interim period. With that, I'll pass it over to my colleague Thomas to share more about how SBP's programs fit into this very same time.
Thanks, Reese. And again, thanks for those of you who took some time out of your day to join us and hear about SBP's programming and our approach to response and recovery. Just by way of introduction, I serve as SBP COO. Like Reese, I've been with SBP for 13 years. Kind of a fun fact, Reese and I started about a week difference between each other, both as AmeriCorps members. And for years here, my colleagues at SBP and we've seen the pain and the suffering that's endured by communities that are affected by disasters. And I just feel so privileged to work with some of the best and brightest folks in the space to solve problems and to shrink that amount of time between disaster and recovery for those that were affected. So with our understanding of how federal recovery dollars and philanthropy support the disaster recovery and resiliency process, SBP has learned over the years that how we show up after a disaster, it matters. And as you heard Tim say, 2024 is forecasted to be an above average year for major disasters. So I want to take a little bit of time here to walk us through the activities and the action steps of SBP's response and recovery process. Now, out of the gate, SBP responds to disasters with really two key intents. The first is to offer advice and direction to communities on how to recover fast and to avoid the common inefficiencies of disaster recovery programming. Now, the second is to contribute meaningfully to the recovery and the rebuilding efforts and serve the most vulnerable. So here's how we get there. Our first step is coordination. SBP is researching. We're running analysis on the cone storm impact, the socioeconomic demographics and characteristics of the communities that are in the storm's path. We're starting to form this picture of what's to come, who's going to be hurt. With funding that our team has raised earlier in the year, we're standing with the confidence that we can respond in force. Now, once it's safe, usually 48 to 72 hours after the storm has passed, SBP will deploy our assessment team. The goal of that team is to bear witness and connect with community leaders and scope for a wider initial response. We'll distribute resources and we'll partner with local groups to get to the hardest to reach areas. Then after 4 to 7 days, we've generally gathered enough intel to guide the next iteration of our response, which is deploying our disaster corps team, who will muck and gut and do mold suppression on houses. We'll coordinate roof tarping. And the aim in this moment, y'all, is really to stop the bleeding. It's to try and contain that damage that was done to a property so that it doesn't get worse. Within weeks, we begin offering training to local groups and government agencies. What we've seen is that often local leaders, they're having their first disaster recovery experience in the most high stakes moment. As a little anecdote here, last week, our leadership team, we heard from the mayor of one of the most disaster affected cities along the Gulf Coast. And he shared that, his perspective and experience was just because he was voted in as mayor, it didn't mean that he had all the answers. And he felt that, especially when his community was hit by a hurricane. And so SBP, we first offer a helping hand, and then we really lock arms with government officials to help them navigate those early weeks of response. And historically, companies have supported what SBP calls our Regional Recovery Acceleration Week. And there we bring together subject matter experts and local leaders over a week-long workshop to learn best practices in disaster recovery. And I just want to give a special shout out to our friends over at AT&T and Toyota and Farmers Insurance who have supported these events in the past. Okay, so meanwhile, SBP is supporting residents who applied for FEMA assistance but were denied or under-awarded funds from FEMA. And we call this our disaster assistance program. As you heard Reed speak to just a moment ago, the average FEMA award, it's just over $4,000. It's not enough to recover. So SBP offers free appeal assistance to survivors who qualify for additional award funding, but were under-awarded by FEMA originally. And it's with these funds that homeowners are better positioned to bridge that gap and make critical emergency repairs to their homes. And finally, in these early moments, SBP leadership is helping to shape the local government action plans that guide long-term recovery. And it's with this that the SBP team is beginning to lay the groundwork for our Recovery Acceleration Fund. Now, truthfully, we could probably host another webinar just on the Recovery Acceleration Fund, so I'll share just a quick version here. Now, earlier, we showed how long it takes for recovery dollars to hit the ground after a disaster. The Recovery Acceleration Fund, it helps qualified homeowners make repairs to their homes with loans that will eventually be reimbursed when those federal recovery dollars are available, sometimes 2+ years after the storm. This is a program that is only a few years old at SBP, but it's fundamentally changing the lives of survivors and demonstrating a better way to do disaster recovery. So let's push ahead to the recovery and reconstruction phase. Our disaster assistance program, it continues to run. Generally, it can be up to 1.5 years providing FEMA appeal assistance, depending on that FEMA application window. This is an ongoing service as FEMA denials or under awards are continuing throughout the recovery process. Our build program will start 3 months out, and this is largely resource dependent, which can affect the scale of our build program and the duration of that program. Federal funds won't arrive for a couple of years, and so you heard Reed say philanthropic is what carries us through until we can leverage those federal funds on behalf of homeowners. So along the way, our build program, it will leverage volunteers and AmeriCorps members and subcontractors to rebuild homes for the most vulnerable homeowners in this disaster-affected community. While SBP is running our own program, we're also seeking to raise the capacity and the effectiveness of local organizations through sharing resources and our best practices. We're injecting philanthropic funds and training to smaller local nonprofits that are seeking to grow to meet the community need. And we do this through our SHARE program. I'll give you a little example here. So in Houston, the restoration team is a faith-based, locally led entity, part of the community fabric that was providing minor repairs and modifications in years prior. When Hurricane Harvey hit Houston, the restoration team said, we want to do more. And so over the years, SBP has helped them scale their programming by providing AmeriCorps members, funding, and training on best practices in nonprofit-led disaster recovery. So anywhere 6 to 12 months after the storm, we'll begin mobilizing the Recovery Acceleration Fund. And again, through this program, we're helping families receive the benefits of the federally funded recovery program months or years before they otherwise could. And then SBP's Advise team is monitoring the performance of long-term recovery programs and providing technical assistance and advisory service to help overcome challenges. An example, so in 2018, North Carolina was rocked with Hurricane Florence. And for close to 3 years, the state struggled to scale its home repair program. Through our Advise services, SBP helped the North Carolina Office of Resilience and Recovery more than double its construction capacity and production rate through consultation and training, which was putting more families back into their homes faster than before. The recovery challenges in North Carolina, what they face is not unique. 6 out of 7 disaster recovery programs across the country are slow spending their recovery dollars. And make no mistake, like these are well-intended, good local leaders that are doing the best they can. They're just without the direction and guidance that they need. So SBP's experience and that guidance is materially affecting the outcomes of these programs. And all of this leads to more families getting home faster. Now, finally, SBP will seek the conditions to implement our Opportunity Housing Program. The loss of housing stock after a disaster, it surely affects homeowners, but it also puts extreme pressure on the availability and affordability of rental units in affected markets. To help combat this, SBP's Opportunity Housing Program looks for opportunities to help recovering communities develop more housing stock and create more affordable, sustainable neighborhoods for the future. With this framework, I want to walk through how our response and recovery programming and our fundraising efforts played out for Hurricane Ian in Florida. Now, importantly, every program in SBP's wheelhouse has been mobilized for Hurricane Ian. So let's start at the beginning. The storm hit September of 2022. Days after, SBP deployed 2 assessment teams, one from New Orleans and one from our office in Panama City, Florida, down to Southwest Florida and Orange County to assess the damage. Our disaster corps team was deployed and ran through November, providing muck, gut, and mold suppression services to vulnerable homeowners. We placed team members at the Joint Field Office in Tallahassee, which was a first for SBP, where we helped the coordination and support of non-governmental organizations that were responding across the state. In October, we launched our FEMA appeals program across the state, and we began our share granting, which offered $350,000 in grants to small, locally led nonprofit groups. In December, we hosted our Regional Recovery Acceleration Week. We convened over 50 local and government leaders, which seeded interest in ongoing advisory services and the Recovery Acceleration Fund. We also supported the design and the rollout of the Sheltering at Home for Recovery Continuation Program. This was in partnership with our friends at Volunteer Florida. And it's through this program where SBP provided immediate repairs to vulnerable homeowners so that they could remain in their homes as they navigate the recovery process. Come January, the Recovery Acceleration Fund advocacy begins in earnest. Our BUILD program begins in Southwest Florida, providing full rebuild services for those affected by Ian. And by June, we had completed over 100 of these shelter-in-place projects in partnership with Volunteer Florida. Now, over these last 6 months, we saw the sunsetting of our FEMA appeals program because that window came to an end. We saw the sunsetting and are experiencing the closeout of the shelter-in-place program. We're completing our final Ian builds next month, and proudly, the Recovery Acceleration Fund, this continues. Now, while Hurricane Ian, it's probably a distant memory for most people across the country, it's important to highlight that communities are still in need and will be recovering for years to come. And it's thanks to supporters like you that SBP and our partners on the ground have not forgotten communities and the families that are in need. And over the past 2 years, we've accomplished some really great things together. Let me highlight a few. First, we've completed 566 homes. That's 566 families across 11 Florida counties who are now home and resting easy and more secure because of our work. Our disaster assistance program worked directly with disaster survivors to advocate for more FEMA assistance. The result here was a collective $1.3 million in increased awards for 172 households. And then finally, thanks to our partnership with Volusia County, we are rebuilding homes via the Recovery Acceleration Fund, who otherwise would have to wait maybe another 18, 24 months to access those federal recovery dollars. Now, as we begin to close here, I want to center us on one homeowner that directly benefited from SBP's programming. So in the center here, you'll see Miss Sabine. Miss Sabine is a Navy veteran. Her home took on flood water with Hurricane Ian. She was denied her insurance claim. She missed the FEMA application window. We were able to complete her home back in February, and this marks the first project completed through the Recovery Acceleration Fund and is a direct result of how SBP responded and fundraised and served following Hurricane Ian. And it's thanks to you, your investment in SBP. It positions us to do the hard work, the necessary work, to shrink the time between disaster and recovery for those who need it most. With that, I'd like to hand this back to Tim as we aim to answer some of the questions that were raised with the time that we have remaining. Tim?
Thanks, Thomas. Hey, before you get out, you mentioned ways that SBP can support employees at companies. Can you repeat those real quickly?
Yeah, absolutely. And so there are a few things that SBP can do to support employees of companies. So first is we can offer pre-disaster preparedness training. And so guiding the employee base to understand their risks and to take steps to mitigate against them so that we both have a more resilient workforce and a community that is better positioned to weather any potential storm. So we can offer that. Assuming a storm hits your employee base, SBP can support via our disaster assistance program and frankly help your employees ensure that they're getting the maximum award available to them through FEMA. And then third is we can also offer post-disaster training guides, resources, and in-person and remote training to help your employee base navigate the recovery process. So those are a few ways, and I'm proud that in Hurricane Ian, we partnered directly with UPS in supporting their base. It's something that we've done over the years in a variety of disasters, and something we can continue to give.
Great, thank you. We have a few minutes for questions. There was a question in the chat. Where can we learn more about the Recovery Acceleration Fund? Sometimes we call that RAF. So if you're on our website and you see RAF, that's what that means. I will pass it to Reese to answer that.
You can reach out to me, Reese at sbpusa.org, and I'd be happy to share a quick set of slides on it, or to find some time and walk you through those slides whenever it's convenient for you. I think it's one of the more innovative things we're doing, and that the potential application for it has real transformative power. We could take money that's on the sidelines, fallow, not involved in recovery at all now, and lend it to people who are otherwise not going to get access to capital. We can take folks who usually wait the longest on the government to provide them the least, and we can provide them with what they need much earlier in the process. So I think it could really change how we serve low-income communities after disasters, and I'd be excited for an opportunity to share more about it with anyone who's interested.
Cool. If there are any other questions, please type them into the Q&A. We have another minute or two. Hey, I got another question for you, Reese. You mentioned the $4,300. If FEMA doesn't pay for home repairs, what do most people do for funding?
Some folks launch a GoFundMe account. I mean, those who are looking to FEMA for assistance, Tim, are often underinsured or completely uninsured. And so there's no policy that they're going to call on to get assistance. They go to FEMA hoping they'll access enough to rebuild, but they often don't. The $4,300 will be used to make critical repairs to the home that prevent damage getting worse. But Thomas could, probably not count the amount of homes we've walked into where folks have rewired with the electrical outside the wall, or they're dealing with a slop sink because they didn't receive enough money to repair the home properly. So they made scatty repairs to get the home functional right away. Add to that temporary housing costs, the replacement of clothing and silverware, lost items after disasters, and $4,300 disappears pretty quickly. To the point about the $42,000, just like I said before, to receive the maximum grant, your home would have to be completely destroyed, in which case $42,000 wouldn't be nearly enough to rebuild it or buy a new one. And so sort of the same $4,300 problem, just moved up the scale.
Got it. Another question, actually for either of you, but maybe this is for Reese. Our programs, we're working with local governments, and that requires a level of trust. What efforts do we need to make to establish that trust with the local governments for them to want to work with us?
That's it's a really great question. And I think touting the investment that SBP has made in communities, and importantly, the investments that SBP is making in communities, is a way for us to begin those conversations in blue sky days, where SBP is talking about the kind of resilience and preparedness trainings that we're offering to communities, where we're talking about the investment of fellows in communities, where there are opportunities to show local elected officials that we care about their community and communities like theirs before there's an event and many people's hair is on fire and we're trying to get them to pay attention to how we want to help from a response phase. So I think leaning more heavily on the investments we're making before disasters, and really bringing that lens and those connection opportunities everywhere SBP is doing business will help us get the word out there and forge those connections before we really need them.
Okay. One last question, then we'll, how does the partnership of SBP with the City of New Orleans and NORA support SBP's mission?
In a couple of ways. One is the partnership positions SBP to scale and run our opportunity housing program here in New Orleans. So the the placement of opportunity housing in New Orleans, a city that for decades has struggled with resilient, affordable, accessible housing. Our partnership with the city has allowed us to scale that program, and something that we're really proud of. And secondly, we have a really great relationship with the Office of Community Development that has allowed SBP to access north of $1 million to provide home repair services to residents across New Orleans. And so what I think is particularly beautiful about SBP's partnership with the city is it's based in like values and like mission, where the city is committed to investing in its residents and providing greater access to secure, sustainable, resilient housing. And SBP is able to get that work done for them. So yeah, it's been a really kind of beautiful relationship and something that continues to develop, and we're deeply grateful for it.
Great. Thank you. We want to be respectful of your time, so we're going to wrap it up there. A very heartfelt thank you for your support, your long-term support and ongoing support, allowing our work to be possible. So thank you. If you have any other questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. We would be happy to engage you in any conversation you want to have. So thank you again for your time.